Please welcome Marissa Brock, Senior Director, Government Affairs and Policy, Sourcemap. Buxton Midyette, Vice President, Marketing and Promotions, SUPIMA. Ben Tomkins, Vice President, Retail Sales, Oritain. And Tsui Yuen-Pappas, Director of Sustainability, Olivia. With Jasmine Malik-Chua, Sourcing and Labor Editor, Sourcing Journal.
Hi everyone, and welcome to our panel, So You're Compliant, Can You Prove It? Supply chain legislation is already here, and more is on its way to crib something that someone said at Textile Exchange last week. There will be 35 new regulations over the next 4 years, which is the equivalent of 4 cotton harvests or roughly 8 fashion weeks. So are you doing the necessary due diligence to back up your claims? Do you have visibility throughout your supply chain? And perhaps most critically, will your shipments make it through customs? So Marissa, let's start with you. We have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in force in the US, the CSDDD on its way in the EU. There's the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, and Canada's Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor in the Supply Chain Act, which just rolls off the tongue. And that's just for starters. Can you give us an overview of what the compliance outlook will be in 2024 and the kind of data disclosures that companies will need to make?
Absolutely, and thank you, Jasmine, and to all my fellow panelists here. The next 2 to 3 years are really going to be transformative for supply chain due diligence. I think most of us can agree that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act really opened the floodgates for due diligence legislation. It really changed the game for companies, for the degree of information that's expected, and also for the amount of visibility that's expected into the supply chain. A lot of companies that were dealing with the UFLPA when it went into effect realized that they didn't have the visibility needed into their end-to-end supply chain, all the way upstream, who they're supplying from, or excuse me, who they're sourcing from, who their suppliers are, where they're based, and what are the types of relationships they have with those suppliers. And some of the legislation that you mentioned, CSDDD, which is coming, the EU forced labor ban is also coming, the German Supply Chain Act. Canada has a forced labor law that goes into effect in May of next year. Mexico does as well. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. The amount of visibility that's expected is only increasing. And a lot of the European laws, the EU laws, are looking to learnings from the UFLPA. What has worked, what hasn't worked, what types of what has enforcement looked like, and what types of detentions have occurred under the UFLPA. And so the amount of data and the types of disclosures they vary by legislation, but there absolutely is a common through line across all of these pieces of legislation. And it really is that visibility into the supply chain, the need to know who you're sourcing from, the ability to disclose that, whether that is names and addresses and locations of the suppliers that you're sourcing from, whether that is what types of business relationships you have with them, how your product is being transformed across the supply chain. And when we talk about the UFLPA, the reporting that we're referring to is, God forbid you get a detention under the UFLPA and you have to provide additional information to Customs and Border Protection. You have to be able to demonstrate the chain of custody of your product. You have to be able to demonstrate that you're not sourcing from the areas that are in scope for the UFLPA. But when we're talking about things like, for example, the EU deforestation regulation, which will be relevant for those of you who work in fashion and are using leather within your supply chain, for example, there are customs declarations that are required. And so there's a very specific amount of information that you'll need to be able to provide before your product is placed on the EU market. So again, this really varies by legislation, but that common through line is the need to understand where your products are coming from and who you're sourcing from. Whether the data disclosures are upon request from government authorities, whether it is an annual report, whether it is a public report, like will be the case for Canada's forced labor law, which will be really interesting to see how that comes to fruition, or whether it is something like the EU's digital product passport, where there's information that would be public for consumers. So it's not just private information that's either being disclosed to the government or staying within the confines of your company, but there could be information that's required to be disclosed publicly. So what I'll conclude by saying is I think what's really critical to get ahead of the next 2 to 3 years is conducting a gap analysis into your supply chain. What information do you currently have, and where are you just missing these wide swaths of information that will be critical? Again, the positive, while this is a lot of information to compile, there is a common through line across these pieces of legislation, even though the reporting structures are different. And so there really is an opportunity for companies that have already been worried about the UFLPA, but maybe have not gained that full end-to-end visibility to get ahead of what's coming out of Europe, what's coming out of North America, and prepare for 2024 and beyond.
Absolutely, thank you. So Buxton, everyone's concerned about cotton right now. It's one of the target categories of the UFLPA because of forced labor in China's Xinjiang region, but there's also forced cotton labor in countries like Turkmenistan, and we just moved out from Uzbekistan was also an issue for a while. What makes cotton so challenging when it comes to authentication and traceability? Where, for example, do we start to lose track of its identity, and what is SUPIMA doing to counter that?
Thank you, Jasmine. Cotton, I think this has been a long-standing challenge for cotton, is that it does lose its identity. And the stage at which it loses its identity is at the spinning stage. And that's when the bales, in its raw form, you can look at the bale tag, you can test it, but once it's transformed into yarn, it is impossible to, through physical testing, to identify, the provenance, the origin, the quality. So, I don't know if anyone in this room has been to a spinning mill. Any show of hands? Well, I'm a big fan I love a good mill visit. Well, what happens in a spinning mill, there's the first stage of operation is what's called the opening room. And so they take these 500-pound bales, they'll lay down 20 to 30 of them in what they call lay down, and then skim the top inch off of each of those bales to kind of begin make a uniform blend of the quality. So, at that stage, you may have in the warehouse bales that are compliant with your content requirements. But are those bales in the warehouse at the spinning mill on that line in the opening room? That's the big question. And unless you have someone physically sitting in the opening room, looking at that laydown and making sure those 25 bales are compliant, whether it's organic, Egyptian, SUPIMA, whatever requirements you have, it could be a blend too, but you need to physically verify and see that those bales align with your requirements. You can't deconstruct a yarn afterwards and see, is it extra long staple, is it regular cotton, is it organic? We've seen many kind of class action lawsuits around that, trying to make claims that they deconstructed yarns and could detect the cotton type. Sadly, not true, or else SUPIMA, we would have been doing that for decades. This really led us on a path. We really came to the conclusion that we had to find a way to identify fiber through its inherent properties, that the fiber itself would carry the identifiers that take it back, that authenticate it as SUPIMA, because there's 90 countries around the world, hundreds of thousands of farmers that grow cotton. We grow all of our cotton in the United States, 300 family farms, it's extra long staple cotton. We need to find a way to distinguish SUPIMA from all the other cotton out there so we could identify it. There's a 2 to 3 times premium on the price for SUPIMA, a lot of incentive to substitute lesser qualities, lower priced cottons for SUPIMA. And so that led us on this journey to be able to identify SUPIMA through its inherent properties. We first tried DNA testing. That was very beneficial in that we were able to distinguish ELS between regular cotton. That was a big source of mixing, but we still had to differentiate SUPIMA from the other extra long staple cottons, Egyptian, Peruvian, Chinese, and that really led us into forensics, and that's when we met Ben and his team at Oritain and found that through forensic signs, isotopes, and rare elements, we not only could authenticate that it was SUPIMA, but very importantly, the added bonus is that it could also take us back to the origin and the geographic location for where it was grown. A cotton grown in Bakersfield versus El Paso versus Phoenix area, which was the second part. We really started on the journey out to authenticate our fiber so that our brands, our consumers would have that assurance. But it was really that second part that led us to understand that it was equally important to understand the journey and the origin. And so it's really working with Oritain to authenticate SUPIMA and layering on top of that digital traceability, working with textile genesis. So I mean, we really started off trying to authenticate SUPIMA, but ended up in a whole different but very exciting place.
Yeah, technology is so amazing. So Ben, given this deluge of regulation that's on its way, if not already here, and this is the question that everyone wants to know the answer to, what makes for a strong due diligence and verification posture?
Absolutely. So just for those in the audience, and Buxton, you've done my job for me, but just to give a bit of insight to Oritain. So we use forensic science to prove the origin of products, and I've gone through a 45-minute presentation before for someone at the end to put their hand up and go, so you're the CSI of cotton, and that would have saved everyone 45 minutes. So I'll do that today, but happy to pick into it a little bit more. It's a great question, and it's the sort of the golden ticket question. I think we're in a fortunate enough position, and I use fortunate carefully, but we're almost 18 months into one of the most stringent regulations that's being placed upon the textile and cotton industry, and that's the UFLPA. And so with that, we have a little bit of benefit of hindsight as to what enforcement looks like, but also what best practices look like from what should importers of record brands, retailers be doing. And we really see that as three key burdens of proof, or three key buckets. The first is, can I prove that there is no financial nexus within my supply chain to a banned entity? That's number one. That's where those AI-based tools are going to be absolutely critical as part of that. The second component is then, can I prove that there was no use of forced labor within my supply chain? That's where, again, critical as part of supply chain mapping and also that aggregation of documentation. And then the final component, as we see it, is that raw material verification piece. And that's where that forensic level testing comes into play. And it's becoming more and more important. Of course, I'm biased, I will say that. But even week before last, there was a DHS, Department of Homeland Security Committee hearing, sort of looking to step up the enforcement that CBP has been placing under the UFLPA, but also the use of isotopic testing as part of that. So I think that really speaks to the importance of having those processes in place, but also having the ability to substantiate those claims. And although we're speaking about this from a UFLPA lens, it's also not only from a risk mitigation, but it's also to tackle those lovely and wonderful acronyms of regulations that are coming down the track as well.
Absolutely. And Sue, can you talk about, from a brand perspective, the challenges that you face at Ellis and Olivia in gathering all this data to meet the compliance requirements? I know that you started using AI, so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first of all, as an industry, there's a general rule of denial that all of this is happening, from legislation to the science that is now available to trace all of this. So that was the first challenge, convincing as many of you in this room, your C-suite, to understand these challenges and that it's very real right now. And it's something I always tell my team, we don't want to get caught. We don't want a shipment caught, burned. What does that do to your entire season? What does that do to your entire bottom line? So with that, one of the biggest challenges, getting funds allocated to help in this process. Obviously, there's a tremendous amount of paperwork that we have to navigate.
Yeah.
So as an organization, it was determining who those partners and who internally within our organization is going to be the stakeholder for this. So part of why I joined Alice and Olivia was to take on some of these challenges. I come from a manufacturing sourcing background, so I understand a tremendous amount of where that cotton comes from, where that spinning happens. So part of my job was looking at all those different resources out there that could help us. What are the tools? And AI was a big part of that because we have such a disjointed, siloed supply chain. That's the truth. A lot of us do not know where our cotton comes from raw cotton. And with the legislation, we needed to prove that. We needed to prove not just documentation, if you have a vertical program, for so many years we didn't ask those questions. We didn't ask who the textile mill was. We didn't ask who the spinner was. We didn't ask all those questions, and now we have to. So we're able, after doing a lot of research, we ended up partnering with Earthstream, which does use AI technology. What's impressive is we also partnered with our freight forwarder, and with every shipment that comes through from our manufacturers, this information is fed through the system. And what's really interesting is based on that style, there's essentially a virtual bill of materials that's created. So information on that sweater is pulled from whatever sources in the internet of the style. It identifies that it's cotton or it's viscose. It identifies there's a button on there, there's a zipper on there, and then it starts to drill down on all your supply chain and the data it receives, the manufacturer it's coming from. Does that manufacturer have links to regions or partners that are potential risk in the supply chain? So through billions of data points, it will scrub through, and then at the end we get a report whether or not there's potential risk. So that was a really big step for us to do because we obviously all in this room want to mitigate risk. And there's obviously other platforms out there, but for us, this one made the most sense. It was also about partnerships as far as our entire supply chain and who those partners are that are physically touching our garments. I can't stress enough, I think it's also post-COVID, so many of us are just starting to return to visiting our facilities. And that's a big part of it too. I think, we can rely on AI, we can rely on different partners out there for supply chain mapping, but at the end of the day, people forget that manufacturing is people-based. And you have to get out there. You have to see who your partners are. And maybe that's just tier 1, but sometimes when you're in a factory, you see tier 2, you see tier 3, and I think it's ultimately a combination of due diligence in knowing your supply chain, knowing your resources, and knowing who your partners are. And it's going to take all those things.
It's like tech and FaceTime, that's really important.
Exactly.
So Marissa, what are some of the best practices that you've gleaned from your work that companies can adopt? And are there other use cases for a certain level of traceability and visibility that goes beyond complying with legislation?
Absolutely. Sue just talked about how manufacturing is people-based. I recognize that this is easier said than done for some companies, but for the companies that we've worked with at Sourcemap, the ones that have the most success with identifying who they're working with and conducting a full end-to-end supply chain due diligence process are the ones that have good relationships with their suppliers. That is really essential when we're talking about compliance. If you have suppliers that don't want to provide information to you and have never really interacted with you previously, it just adds an additional hurdle, an additional burden. But what I think is really critical here is this level of visibility is not just useful for compliance. We've started talking about this visibility in the context of compliance because of things like the UFLPA and all of these subsequent legislation, but this has been a helpful process for companies for at least a decade at this point, if not more. When you have end-to-end visibility into your supply chain, you can identify things like critical shortages within your supply chain. You can identify things like bottlenecks within your supply chain. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic caught everyone by surprise, but it also illuminated how many industries were heavily reliant on suppliers, perhaps in one part of the world, and when that supply line is cut off, the entirety of your supply chain is essentially brought to its knees. And so, you know, there's some degree where there's only so much you can get ahead of that problem, but having visibility into your supply chain can at least give you, you know, one step ahead to identify those problems before they become enormous issues that shut down your supply chain. And what I'll say as well is, independent of compliance, a lot of companies have codes of conduct for their suppliers, processes that they are expecting their suppliers to adhere to. And when you don't have that visibility, you don't necessarily know whether your suppliers are adhering to your company's code of conduct and these internal processes that you've set forth. And so again, another really essential use case for this level of visibility. It can streamline your business, it can eliminate redundancies, it can make your supply chain more efficient, really across the board.
Great. And so, Buxton, one thing that comes up a lot in conversations about supply chain is who is going to pay for all of this, right? Tracing is expensive, authentication is expensive. Can you talk us through Acre and how you split the bill?
Thank you. And this is the classic question that comes up time after time. And so when SUPIMA, we were in the process of launching putting together our Acre project, which is short for authenticity, quality, and responsibility. This is, you know, hosted on Textile Genesis using Oritain for verification across the supply chain. But as we were organizing this, we decided that we would, you know, survey our group of, you know, 300 plus manufacturers and, you know, 200 plus retailers to find out, you know, who should bear the cost for doing this, because it's quite expensive. And we got a very consistent and unified response from our suppliers, and that was someone else, not me. That they all wanted this, they wanted the traceability, they wanted the authenticity, but that someone else should bear the cost. And so at that point, we decided that we really needed to integrate the cost into the platform, and that this wouldn't, you know, land at the very end where, you know, it's like you're at a dinner and there's a squabble over, you know, who should pay the bill. And it's very contentious, you know, and it's usually between the end brand retailer and that tier one supplier, and like, no, you should pay, you should pay, you should pay. Oh, they should pay it. No. So what we decided to do is within the platform on Textile Genesis, that, you know, back to the spinner, you know, they buy their bales of SUPIMA, they convert it into yarn, and at that moment when they sell the yarn, and this is all happening on the platform, to convert the yarn into a fiber coin, they must pay a fee of 55 cents for every kilo of SUPIMA yarn. And at that point, that fiber coin then gets passed, is transferred to a fabric manufacturer, then to cut and sew, and then to the retailer. And that way, the cost, this is much more equitable, that the cost is built into the product, it is shared across the supply chain equally, It is a cost like, the electricity to run the plant. This is just becomes a baseline integrated cost, which is shared equitably. And at the end of this, that retailer brand has full visibility all the way back to the origin of that, that journey for that fiber coin. And so in a way, it ends up being a turnkey solution where, the costs are shared. There's no squabbling over the bill.
Right. And Ben, there's another question that comes up is how much information is enough? You have different regulating bodies, each with slightly different requirements. Is there a certain threshold that companies should be aiming for in terms of disclosure?
Absolutely, and hopefully a lot of the work that's being undertaken isn't duplicative, but it can be additive to the different regulations that are coming into effect. So Marissa mentioned the work under UFLPA. Hopefully that is transferable and usable for Canadian, Mexican, EU forced labor statutes. Hopefully all the data that's being collated can also help in the future scenario for digital passport product sort of identity as well. So hopefully the foundation and framework is there. But we almost look to flip the question and ask, well, how much information is insufficient? And although there's budget constraints, personnel constraints, and that brands are taking a lot of steps to get better documentation, have supplier affidavits, chain of custody, all of these things, sometimes that can lead people into sort of a superficial level of compliance because it's still reliant on supplier declarations. So again, and we sort of play the question back to people that we engage with is, although you may be providing supplier affidavits, I wonder, and not expecting hands up in the room, but how many times has a supplier ever come back and said, sorry, I can't sign that affidavit because I am sourcing that cotton or I am connected to that particular entity? I would imagine it's very few or possibly even none. So I think that just goes to show the importance around having the ability to adopt tools that can help to validate that information. And absolutely, it has to be a multifaceted approach. But hopefully, again, all of that groundwork is helping to support from an additional perspective, set that foundation, and then it's just adding on those stepping blocks as more and more regulations come into effect.
Great. So Sue, really quickly, because I think we're running out of time, the thing about the supply chain is that it's so convoluted and so fragmented. How do we get everyone involved, attacking this issue of risk mitigation?
I think the key is really partnerships, as you can see even on this stage. The reality is, we have to help each other. Whether you're a manufacturer in a region, we have to spread the cost at the end of the day. If we don't spread the costs, one party in the supply chain can't absorb all of it. And ultimately, we all want to mitigate risk, whether it's on the farming level to, we had someone talk about growing cotton and all of that. It really is, we have to look at it as a full end-to-end entity and basically hold hands in all of this. That's how we're going to get through it.
Great.
And the technology has caught up. I think that's really key.
Wonderful. I think we have time for maybe one question, and there are mics going around if you want to raise your hand. No? Oh, there's one lady over here. There's a mic over there.
Hi, everyone. We talked about expense. Will prices come down as more people the usage goes up on your port efficiencies and the overall pricing of this isotope testing? And also, what about the lead times? Part of the prohibitive factors is the cost, but it's also the lead time. So if you can address that.
Does anyone want to take this?
I'll take this. I've been in production for 30 years, and I live by that calendar, so I understand. I think the key is planning. We all live and die by the calendar, so all of this is planning. The reality is, when the EU's, we work with a lot of EU retail partners, they started demanding testing. Guess what? Testing got built into the calendar. And now with supply chain vetting and, I'm demanding all those certificates prior to shipping, prior to the and then getting all my documents in place. So like right now, I've vetted everything through past January already within my organization, so that we kind of have an inkling till that shipment hits the forwarder and we go through the AI learning and all of that. I have a pretty good idea within my supply chain if there's any sort of slight hint of risk. And I think that's really it. We have to build it into the calendar. It's unfortunate, but that's what we have to do.
I like that you've developed a spider sense for this now. Well, thank you so much, everyone. That's all the time we have. Please thank my wonderful panelists.